All right, guys. All right, guys. Welcome to the part two of population growth and regulation. And in this section, we are going to go over some mathematical modeling in population ecology. So, if you look at this figure to your left, you are looking at a population growth model. Uh, on this graph on y-axis, you are looking at time. Y-axis, you are looking at number of individuals. Um, and you can also see that in the y-axis um, that axis is plotted on a logarithmic scale. The reason is, like logarithmic scales help us to kind of cluster extremely large numbers in a shorter physical scale. That's the only reason. Um, and then there are four graphs we are looking at over here, or four growth curves. And the idea is for me to show you different how different age classes differ in their growth rates, right? So the red, green, and blue graphs corresponds to different age classes, okay, three age classes. And we can see in generally all three of them are increasing with time. But for all three of them, in early years, we clearly see that there are considerable variations in growth rate, right? They are kind of all over the place. But after a while, what happens is that it kind of stabilizes, right? And then you kind of see that all the three curves are now increasing at this kind of a very similar rate. And since those curves in this area is parallel to each other, clearly that's evidence that after initial fluctuations, all the three age classes are actually now growing in the same rate. And this yellow or orange colored curve is kind of a summation of all the three age classes. And you can see, although different age classes have this significant variations in early population growth, um, big, this, when you sum them up, it kind of averages out. Once massive fluctuations are averaged out by another, that neutralizes the massive fluctuations, right? So the idea is, yes, different age classes earlier in their developmental or growth curve may massively vary, but different age classes behave in different ways, so they can kind of cancel each other out, and ultimately the overall population does not show that kind of a massive fluctuation. You can see the overall population fluctuations are relatively smaller, even uh, in the early 50 years. Now, um, if you actually plot population growth rate with time, right, like I mentioned earlier, in the early few years, you could see some major fluctuations, but down the road, it actually evens out, right? The population growth rate becomes a constant, right? Now, my interest is actually trying to calculate that population growth rate, and we call it lambda. Right now, don't freak out by these connotations. If you don't like the connotation, well, just like when you're studying, say what it really is: population growth rate. The reason why we use different connotations is that we are going to talk about about three different types of growth models, and they have different behaviors. It is still the population growth rate, but they behave in different ways. To In order to delineate that, and in order to make the mathematical formula easy to like write, we use the connotations. That's the only reason why we have those connotations. Now, um, the lambda population growth rate is actually kind of a ratio of population size from a particular year to the following year. Okay, so that's what I mean over here is t, and population size at the time t, and the population size at time t plus 1. Okay, um, again, look at this formula over here. Lambda population growth rate equals n sub t plus 1 divided by n sub t. What does this mean? My denominator is the current population size, right? And my numerator is population size after a single time frame. Like if you're looking at in this graph, we are looking at years. I'm looking at year later. Um, if my t is actually let's substitute values of this nt and t plus 1, right? Look at right over here in this particular arrow, right? What is my n sub t? 4. Current my current time frame is year 4, right? So I replace t by 4, n sub 4, right? Now what does n sub 4 corresponds to, right? Go up over here until it hits that particular curve, go this way, and if I read this logarithmic curve, it corresponds to something like 20, right? Now what is my t plus 1? So plus 1 is after a single year. So if my nt is 4, my nt plus 1 is going to be 5. All right, let's try to read the number of individuals at t plus 1. Now t is 4, 4 plus 1 is 5, right? It's slightly below 40, so I'm going to call it 39, right? It's a very good guess. So my population growth rate lambda equals population size at year 4, right? Population size at year 5 divided by population size at year 4, right? So it is 29 divided by 20, roughly somewhere around, somewhere slightly lower than 2. It's 1.8, 1.9, something like that. So it's easy as that, right? Now, let's talk about, now you understand the basics. Based on this, you understand the basics of understanding population growth curve, right? Or rather, you understand how to calculate population growth rate from a population growth curve, right? Now, remember this very super simple principle, right? And let's try to use that principle to create a couple of other interesting growth models, right? Um, Now, first, exponential and geometric growth models. Now, those are two different growth models, but their behavior is extremely similar. So that's why I'm going to talk about both of them at the same time, right? And their formula, they have two different model formula, and they're quite similar to each other as well. So, um, what kind of actual populations, natural populations, follow exponential or geometric growth? Um, well, annual grasses and cicadas are two examples, right? Because they actually only reproduce once. These adult plants, these adult cicadas only reproduce once in their life cycle. Um, and after the reproduction, they die. So what they do is they actually reproduce, as a population. Um, all the individuals reproduce at regular time intervals, and all individuals reproduce at the same time, and after the reproduction they die. The same case for the grasses and the cicadas, right? So because of this regularity, and because they reproduce on discrete time intervals, right, we call that we call that these species reproduce in synchrony, meaning all of them reproducing at the same time in a given time frame. And after that, they all disappear. And when the time returns again, they will reproduce, disappear, reproduce. So that's how their life cycle proceeds, right? Well, when I say disappear, I mean the event of reproduction goes away, right? The individuals stay there, but they do not reproduce. Now, in this case, if population size changes by a constant rate from one discrete time duration to the next. Now, remember, why am I calling this a constant rate? Remember how we calculated lambda earlier, right? We did realize that the population growth rate fluctuated significantly earlier, but down the road it stabilizes. So because of this stability, because you are seeing like a flatter curve over here, right? Lambda, the population growth rate, is a constant at a longer time frame. So that's why we consider the growth rate to be a constant from one discrete time interval to the next, right? So if that is a constant, right, the number of individuals added to the population gets larger with time, okay? So because of that, right, because of this constant population growth rate, right, the number of individuals reproducing, or the number of individuals present in that particular population, and the number of reproducing individuals will grow incrementally. Let's assume lambda to be 2, right? And let's assume that, meaning what? If lambda is 2, the population size will double from one reproductive season to another, right? If you started at 10, right, after the first season, you will end up with 20. Then all of those 20 will reproduce, right? And the original 10 will die, right? The remaining 20 will reproduce, right? And they will make 40 in the next reproductive cycle, and that that 20 will die, remaining 40 will reproduce by the same constant, making 80. So what do you see over the time? From at the first time frame, 10, in the second season 20, third season 40, next season 80, next season 80 multiplied by 260, right? And then 320, like that. What you see is an incremental growth of the number of individuals surviving in the population, contributing to reproduction. So with time, as you see in this particular graph, right, you start with a very small population, right, and that population grows very slowly earlier, but when the number of individuals increase, right, the doubling, because of the doubling, the total number of individuals in that population will increase dramatically. Okay, and this kind of a population growth, right, that happens in discrete time intervals, where the total number of individuals increase dramatically and exponentially, nearly exponentially, is considered a geometric population growth rate, right? And this is applicable only when lambda is greater than 0. Okay, and now the original population growth model, this population growth rate calculation, was this one, right? And if you want to get an idea about what nt plus 1 is, you need to multiply lambda by n sub t, right? And this one is actually no different from that particular equation, right? This is the number of individuals, or the number of individuals in that population at time t, right? What is n sub 0? N sub 0 is um, the average number of offspring left by n sub 0 is the number of individuals at the initial time frame in that particular population, right? And what is lambda? Lambda is the average number of offspring left by an individual during one time interval. In other words, it is actually the reproductive rate, right, or population growth rate, right? And t is actually the number of time intervals, right, in which the reproduction takes place. Okay, so now that is that everything that I explained right now is geometric growth model. Okay, now exponential growth model is very similar, but what I just explained is a geometric growth model. This formula I just explained to you is actually a mathematical representation of geometric growth model, where future population size is predicted based on the current population, right, or the population at the starting point multiplied by the population growth rate raised to the power of the number of time intervals within which the reproduction happens, right? It is as easy as that. um, Now let's talk about the exponential growth model, right? And you will realize how similar these two are, right? For many species, reproduction does not happen in discrete time intervals, right? So because of, in other words, not all individuals in that particular population will reproduce at the same time in very discrete isolated time frames. So hence you get this asynchronous or non-synchronous reproduction in populations, which actually happens more often than synchronic. um, so reproduction happens at varying times, right? And the reproductive efforts of many species could be continuous rather than limited to discrete time intervals, right? For example, in my previous case, I talked about cicadas. You know that they reproduce in every 13 or 17 years, right? And grasses reproduce in every year, right? But that's not the case in most of the other insects. You know, there are many insects that actually reproduce continuously as long as they have resources available to them. As long as the environmental conditions are suitable, they will keep reproducing. Many small mammals can do the same, particularly rodents can reproduce continuously. Now, because of the continuous reproduction and because of the absence of discrete reproductive seasons, and since they reproduce non-synchronously, different generations can overlap with each other, right? You know, that could happen within the same population. So if population size changes again by a constant rate, right, at each instant time frame. Now we are going by instant time frames because we cannot any longer talk about discrete time intervals, right? The number of individuals added to the population within these instant time frames gets incrementally larger over time, right? Now, since the reproduction is no longer limited to discrete time intervals, you end up with this exponential continuous growth. Earlier, the growth was near exponential, right? The growth pattern between exponential and geometric growths are quite similar, but earlier reproduction happened in discrete time intervals, but now it happens continuously, right? So the only difference is actually in this case is reproduction being continuous as opposed to discrete, and reproductive efforts being non-synchronous as opposed to synchronous in the previous case, right? Both types of growth models predict a J-shaped, rapidly increasing, slow at first, but subsequently rapidly increasing J-shaped population growth curve. Now, the model is quite the same. If you look at the right, you look at the model, you see the formula. Right on the left hand side, you're looking at the differentiation function, right? You know, this lowercase d to n means what? Very smaller change in the population size within very smaller time frame. This is what this dn divided by dt means. It is in fact not dn dt. It's actually differentiation function um, for the population size changes at a very small time frame, right? That equals what? Right? So this ratio is the rate of population growth rate, right? Changes in the number of individuals in a very small time frame, aka also known as rate of population change, equals per capita rate of increase, the population growth rate per capita rate of increase multiplied by original number of individuals, right? So now exponential growth model can be represented in many different ways. This form can actually be converted simply by mathematical operation into the following, this particular form. I do not want you to know both of them. If you can successfully understand one model, that's good enough for me. Now, this R, right, is per capita rate of increase, is also known as exponential growth rate. It is also known as intrinsic rate of increase, right? Now, R and lambda are very analogous, right? They correspond to rate of population change, right? And both of them can be calculated based on your survivorship curve, based on your life history tables. Okay, now let's try to talk about what limits population growth. Um, so based on these two models you learn, geometric and exponential models, again, they are extremely similar in terms of the behavior, right? You might assume, you know, like given the J-shaped curve, initially small increments, and after the population number increases to a certain level, the increment rate increases exponentially, right, or geometrically, right? So If you're looking at the J-shaped curve, you might actually ask the question, wait, can the population grow into infinite numbers, particularly the upper end of the J shoots all the way to very large numbers? Well, theoretically seems like it can, but does it really go that way? So in the models we studied, the two models we studied so far, right, the what variables actually govern the population size? Well, I mean, if you go quickly backwards, right, the rate of increase, right, and the initial population size, right, seems, and the time, right, seems like those are the three variables that we consider to construct those very basic models. Um, so can you think in the real life, are there any other environmental variables modifying the population growth behavior aside from time, initial population sizes, and the growth rate? Mm, well, hold on your answer. Let's try to tackle this one piece at a time. Population growth can be affected by changes in birth rate, by death rate, right? So that you already accounted. You are looking at the time and you are looking at the initial population size, right? And the R or lambda accounted for the actual the effective increment rate, right? Um, so we didn't exactly accounted for the death, but we kind of accounted for the birth, right? Um, and well, in addition to births and deaths, certain individuals can move into your population and some individuals in your population can move out of. So dispersion and migration can also impact, right, your current population size, okay, which may not be detected by just looking at time or by considering the growth rate constant. And some of these environmental factors that impact population growth are density independent, right? They regulate those factors, regulate population size independent of the current population density. Things like weather, climate, temperature, precipitation, natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, storms, droughts, all of those climate extremities, weather extremities, uh, can result in reductions of population sizes, right? Regardless of the density, right? If let's if you're looking at a particular ungulate population, right? Um, they are impacted by temperature. They are impacted by drought. Droughts may could indicate what? The droughts could indicate that um, they are going to suffer food scarcity, right? Reduced precipitation could indicate that they are going to have problems with water availability, right? Um, a flooding event can completely destroy their foraging grounds, right? So which can impact their food acquisition, right? So in that, so those natural disasters, climatic extremities can result in death of a particular population regardless of their current density, right? Smaller population versus large population will impact equally, will get impacted equally by these environmental variables, right? And so the impacts of the above mentioned factors on the population are not related to their densities, right? High and low density populations will be impacted equally. Um, and so those environmental forces will not increase the population size if the initial population sizes are smaller, right? And also do not substantially decrease the population size if the population size is greater, right? So in other words, the initial population size will not determine the impact of these density independent environmental forces. So density independent growth regulation will not help to stabilize a particular population. Now, the reverse side is density dependent factors. What are density dependent factors? Hmm? Food availability, right? Abundance of food, distribution of food across the habitat, availability of suitable habitats, the surface area of suitable habitats, um, diseases, parasites, pathogenic infections, competition between different individuals of the same species, um, predation risk. All of those are density dependent factors. Impacts of these factors on birth rate, death rate, and dispersion rates are dependent of the true population size or the current population density, right? Let's take an example here, okay? Let's say there's a particular habitat with relatively lower population density, right? Because of the good weather conditions, or due to some reason, the food availability increases and food abundance also increases. So there's enough resources. So consequently, that particular population will start to grow better. They will produce more individuals, and more individuals will survive. As a result, population size will increase. So, for example, let's take another example. This time, let's consider a disease, right? If a population density is higher in a particular given habitat, any parasite or any infectious disease or a pathogen can spread faster, right? And as a result, because of the disease, the population size can decline, right? Ultimately. Um, and the same thing regarding competition. When there are limited resources, if the population density is higher, there will be competition, increased competition between different individuals of the same species. And as a result, the population size could decline because not every individual gets enough resources to survive and reproduce, right? Um, okay, let's also talk about predation, right? Predators tend to focus on high density prey habitats because it's easy to capture prey. When the predation pressure continues in high density habitats, over time, the prey density goes down actually, right? So like that, all of those environmental forces I mentioned in the second bullet point can impact a particular population in response to proportional to population density, right? Impact of these factors on birth rate, death rate, dispersion rates are dependent on the population size or the standing population density. These factors will result in changes in the birth rate, death rate, and dispersal rate, migration, immigration, as the density of the population changes. So density dependent factors, these things I mentioned, operate only when the population density reaches a particular level. In other words, there's a threshold for density dependent factors to kick in, right? If the population density is lower than that particular cutoff limit, you will not observe density dependent factors operating. These factors operate most strongly when the population size is extremely large and dense, right? Think about this. A particular infectious disease can only jump from one host to another if there is a minimum distance between them, right? Um, a predator will only concentrate its hunting efforts in a particular habitat if if the prey density is greater than a particular number. Like that, there is a threshold for these density dependent factors to operate. Okay. Competition will only be significant only if the population density and population size is way greater than the resources available, right? If the population density is lower compared to the resource availability, there is no reason for intra-specific competition to take place. So like that, there is a threshold for density dependent factors to kick in. So density dependent factors are unlikely to impact small populations, unlikely to impact large populations if they are scattered over a greater habitat extent. So when density increases, what happens is actually the birth rate declines because of the density dependent factors, right? And death rate increases because of density dependent regulation, right? Immigration increases. Individuals will leave current habitat, right? Um, and overall, because of that, the density of that population, the size of that population will decline. So in this way, and let's look at the opposite side. If density decreases, birth rate will increase, death rate will decline. Individuals will migrate into this particular habitat, and ultimately the total population size and density will increase. So this way, density dependent factors can increase a population if the standing population size is lower, can increase the population density if the current population density is lower, can decrease the population density if current population size is higher, can decrease the population density, um, can decrease the you know what I mean. It can work vice versa, right? And because of this, density dependent factors can lead to population regulation, or density dependent factors can lead to population stabilization over time, right? I'm actually not going to give you the answers to these questions. Actually, I challenge you to read these questions carefully and answer the questions yourself. So this is the third model that I want you to understand: logistic growth. um, Population growth occurs rapidly at first, um, and then as a result, the abundance of the population, right, actually rises really fast, and then ultimately stabilizes. That's actually the behavior of a logistic growth model. Population grows rapidly first, slows down, and then becomes stable, right? When the population becomes stable, right, we call that stable population size the carrying capacity. In other words, a population that reaches stability through logistic growth is said to have reached the carrying capacity, right? And if you look at the graph over here, like it kind of pictures what I mentioned earlier. There's a phase where you don't see much increase in the population size, right? But soon what happens is it picks up a rapid growth, right? Right, and it grows now exponentially. Remember your exponential and geometric growth curve, right? It looks like that over here. And then what happens when the abundance of the population increases? Slowly the rate at which the population grows declines. The population still keeps growing. You can see the number of individuals are increasing still, but it's not happening at a faster rate than it used to, right? Over here it's a very fast, the rate is extremely fast, right? Let me get the pointer so that I don't do the same thing again. Yeah, very fast growth, right? Still grows, but slowly. And then ultimately, look over here. The population is fluctuating here and there, but overall it's stable, right? So this particular phase of the population is said to remain under carrying capacity, or rather a stable population size. Um, So carrying capacity by definition is the maximum population size, the maximum population abundance that can be supported given the finite availability of biological resources. Right? So this particular curve is roughly S-shaped, right? Kind of a weird S-shaped. And you can see geometric and exponential population growth was J-shaped, where actually it starts exactly the same, but it keep going up. Growth increases initially, like I mentioned, but decreases as the population size gets closer to carrying capacity, right? Now, at the carrying capacity, right, not here, like right over here, the growth rate is effectively zero, right? So, as a result, no change happens to the population size, right? Um, and the intrinsic growth rate R declines as the number of individuals, number of organisms in the population increases, right? So if you look at now, let's take a look at this particular growth model, right? The different parts of the growth model formula is explained over here. To the left side, it is, again, the exactly the same model component you saw earlier in the exponential growth model, right? Changes of number of individuals with respect to a slight change in time, right? So like a differentiation function, right? And then this letter r, lowercase r, is the intrinsic rate of increase, right? And then this n is the population size, current population size, and k is the carrying capacity, right? So in other words, you can also argue that k is the n, right? The population size cannot increase beyond k, right? K represents the maximum number n can assume, right? And as the ratio n divided by k increases, population growth slows, right? So this particular part of the formula, if you look at this formula again, if I kind of conceal 1 minus n divided by k, you're actually looking at exponential population growth rate. So logistic growth model differs from exponential growth model simply by adding 1 minus n divided by k ratio. That is the only new part you're looking at that. So that particular part, that particular model component is actually the net effect of all density dependent factors which reduces R. If right. So if you again think about what I just talked to you about density dependent regulation, right? When the population size increases, when the density increases, certain parameters kicks in and it actually deregulates the increasing population. And if the population size is too small, uh, another set of density dependent factors will upregulate the population and increases the density and whatnot, right? Density and the population sizes. So it is in fact this 1 minus n divided by k is actually a mathematical representation of how all density dependent factors regulate the population size by impacting per capita growth rate, right? So in this situation, the per capita growth rate is actually changing with time, changing with respect to what's happening with respect to density dependent growth regulators. Now, we can actually, based on collectively looking at all three models, um, logistic, geometric. Geometric are very similar in terms of behavior. And then on the other hand, you have logistic, right? So based on those two categories, you can actually identify two different growth forms, right? K selected and R selected. Let's talk about what is K. Let's talk about what is R selected. R selection, right? In this figure, you can see the red is actually the R selection, right? Which is, and that growth behavior is very similar to, is not just similar, it's exactly the same as exponential and geometric growth pattern, right? R selection is an evolutionary selection force that favors greater population growth rate, right? So when the environments actually have initial low population densities, R selection operates, right? For example, if you are looking at a particular habitat that is recently disturbed, if you are looking at a particular habitat that has been uncolonized after a disturbance, right? This could be a forest or a woodland that was hit by a lightning storm. You could be looking at a floodplain that underwent a dramatic major flooding, right? You could be looking at a grassland that has been recently burnt, right? So any of those recently disturbed, uncolonized, open habitat initially could be subjected to R selected growth, right, among different populations. So in this, when R selection is operating, right, it happens when you have a greater resource availability, like a vacant habitat, lots of places to occupy. Um, when the changes are unpredictable, right? For example, if the resource can sprout up out of blue and can disappear, right? The organisms living in that habitat has to evolve certain strategies to maximize utilization of those resources in a short time frame, right? And variable environmental conditions. Organisms living in an environment where the environmental conditions are highly variable required to adopt in such a way to capitalize from favorability during a shorter period of time, right? So, in unpredictable environments where resource availability can change unpredictably, where environmental favorability can appear and disappear quickly, right? Any organism adapted to that kind of habitat has to favor rapid growth, quick ability to quickly assimilate nutrient and food, right, and reproduce faster. Okay, so um, many small organisms, short-lived organisms, can undergo rapid development, right, and can reach early sexual maturity, requires low parental investment and reproduce in such a great rate, meaning very high fecundity, right, um, are some of the life history attributes that you would observe species that are selected, or species that have evolved our selected strategy will show these kind of characteristics. Right? In other words, species that show population growth similar to this red curve, population growth following exponential model, right, will be small organisms, will be short-lived, don't have a long life expectancy, right, will develop and reach sexual maturity really fast, early, and will not perform parental care, will not receive protection or benefits of parental care, yet they will actually repeatedly sire a greater number of offspring. And those offspring will also be quite small, but they will produce a large number of them. Um, so the kind of the motto for these guys is actually live fast, finish your life cycle as fast as possible, and die young, right? And think about running so fast, yeah, you exhaust all your energy, and then you die very early in your life. Right? It's kind of live fast, die young is the motto for our selected species. Examples: insects. Most insects, many smaller vertebrates like rodents follow that particular strategy. Weedy species that we consider that growth really fast. Many actual um, herbs that are considered weed follow our selection. Many fungi, bacteria, right? Many microorganisms actually follow our selection, right? And it's both exponential and geometric growth curves that actually are comparable to our selection, right? And the opposite is K selection, the blue curve, which is actually parallel to or similar to, comparable to logistic growth curve, where the population growth rate is slow rates of increase followed by stabilization, right? In fact, in our selection, the curve, once it hits the maximum capacity, when it hits the K, it actually could collapse, right? Or the environmental conditions, because the unpredictability can change and the population can crash. In our selection, crash does not happen, rather the population reaches stability at carrying capacity, right? So this kind of growth patterns are observed in environments with very high population densities, where the population size stabilizes near the carrying capacity. In these environments, the resource availability, resource richness is limited. So there's a lot of competition occurring amongst different individuals of the same species to capitalize from limited resources. Under these circumstances, through reproduction, individuals sire larger sized fewer offsprings. So they actually invest a lot of energy in producing offspring. Um, so these offspring receive maximum care, right? Parental care is guaranteed, right? And they also, these offspring also receive a lot of resources to ensure their survival, right? As a result, the risk of losing an offspring is quite small. So the investment is appears risky, but in reality, it is rewarded with higher offspring survival. Case-selected species show life history attributes like long gestation periods. They may actually have, in other words, when an individual is born, they are larger, they are well developed, well grown, like an elephant. Okay, takes long time to reach maturity, so they can actually acquire a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and develop and acquire large body sizes. When they are ready to when they are ready to reproduce, they will actually be more mature, robust, larger, which increases their survival and also increases their reproductive success. um, and they actually tend to have a longer lifespan and reproduce multiple times during their lifespan. Most large animals, right, primates, are examples. So here, birds are an excellent example here. Birds, regardless of their sizes, body sizes, are a good example for case selection, right? So the motto, right, or the theme for case selected species is this, right? Live free, die hard. Right? I don't know how many of you actually grew with this particular movie franchise. I did, right? Probably you guys are too young to know what that is. Um, so, um, with that, actually, I finished this lecture. Before that, I finished this lecture. I also kind of produce this challenge to you, right? Can you actually do the calculations and fill in these blanks? You should be able to do this very easily now because you have already done your life history tables. Um, for the exam, I don't expect you to calculate a life history table because you have already done that through your lab activities. This is just a fun exercise I do when we meet in class. But right now, we don't meet in person, so I cannot hold you responsible for doing this. With that, I actually conclude this lecture. That's end of the population growth and regulations. You guys have fun.